Hey guys, tonight we begin with a time when early human ancestors weren't debating philosophy. They were debating whether that rustling in the grass was food, danger, or both. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the world 4.7 million years ago, waking up alive wasn't just a pleasant surprise. It was a statistical anomaly worth celebrating. You didn't open your eyes thinking about breakfast or morning stretches. You opened your eyes thinking, I'm still here, and no one has chewed on me yet. There were no houses, no doors to lock, no guard dogs to bark when trouble was near. If you were lucky, you'd spent the night in a tree, wedged between two branches, in the vague hope that predators preferred their meals without splinters. Less fortunate mornings meant waking up on the open ground, with only a few leaves or a mound of dirt for bedding. Privacy, of course, didn't exist. Everyone in your little group, and sometimes a few hangers-on from neighbouring bands, slept close for warmth and safety. This meant that rolling over could put you face to face with your cousin, a beetle the size of your thumb, or the smelly evidence that last night's berries hadn't agreed with someone. The first thing you did was listen. The forest and grasslands were never silent, and each sound had a meaning. Birds meant daylight and possibly breakfast. Insects meant you weren't frozen to death. And heavy footsteps in the underbrush? Those meant you should already be halfway up the nearest tree. Getting up was an act of courage. You never knew what the night had delivered while you slept. A nearby lion, a python resting in a sunny spot, or a fresh pile of droppings that suggested something big had been here very recently. Once you'd established that you weren't about to be eaten, you scanned for your group. Staying together was your insurance policy. Lone wanderers had the lifespan of an undercooked fish. There was no mirror to check your appearance, but if there had been, it wouldn't have helped. Your hair was matted with leaves, your skin was streaked with dirt, and your only makeup was whatever pollen or berry juice you'd smeared on yourself yesterday. Still, you were breathing. The sun was up, and with that, you'd accomplished the day's first and most important task, existing. The rest of the day would be harder, finding water, food, and shelter before darkness returned. But for this one brief, precious moment, you could bask in the quiet, simple joy of not being dead. If waking up alive was the first victory of the day, finding breakfast was the second, and this one required a little more than just luck. In the prehistoric world, breakfast didn't come with menus, cooking instructions, or expiration dates. It came in three vague categories: plants, animals, and things you really hoped were edible. The morning meal was often dictated by what you stumbled across first. Maybe it was a tree heavy with figs. Maybe it was a bush covered in berries that looked safe, although no one in your group could quite remember if the last guy who ate them had survived. Early humans didn't have field guides to help identify plants. Their method was more experimental. If the taste made your lips tingle, you stopped eating. If it made your vision blurry, you really stopped eating. Protein was harder to come by. If you were ambitious, you might climb a tree in search of bird eggs, which were delicious, fragile, and heavily defended by angry parents with sharp beaks. If you were lucky, you might find a lizard basking in the sun, quick to cook if fire existed, which it didn't, so you ate it raw, chewing carefully to avoid teeth or bones. Sometimes breakfast came pre-packaged in the form of a half-eaten carcass left behind by a predator. This was considered a mixed blessing. On one hand, free meat. On the other, the predator might still be nearby, wondering why you were holding its leftovers. In these situations, eating fast wasn't just a recommendation, it was the only safe option. Water often counted as breakfast too. A few gulps from a muddy stream could help fill an empty stomach, though the side effects included mild dysentery and the occasional hallucination. But when your other option was starvation, you drank anyway, telling yourself it added flavor. All of this was eaten without plates, utensils, or napkins. Meals were taken standing up, crouched down, or on the move, because lingering too long in one spot meant turning yourself into someone else's breakfast. By the time you'd swallowed the last bite, your stomach was only half satisfied, but your survival odds had increased. And in the prehistoric world, that was the only review score that mattered. Finding water was easy. Finding safe water? That was a mythical concept. Rivers, streams, ponds, all of them looked inviting, shimmering under the sunlight, promising life, and delivering a buffet of parasites, bacteria, and the occasional microscopic creature that would set up permanent residence in your intestines. Still, dehydration was not an option. Thirst killed faster than hunger, and in the wild, you didn't get to be choosy. A puddle left over from last night's rain could be a lifesaver. So could a shallow stream, even if it doubled as a crocodile's favorite lunch spot. The risk calculation was simple. Drink now, and maybe get sick later. Or don't drink, and definitely get sick sooner. Of course, there was a method to this madness. You didn't just march up to the water's edge and start sipping. That was the sort of behavior that got you turned into an educational example for the rest of the group. First, you scanned for movement, ripples that weren't from the wind, shadows that lingered just a little too long under the surface. If the coast seemed clear, you approached slowly, crouched down, and drank with the speed of someone who knew they might have to run at any second. Some groups developed clever tricks. Scooping water with cupped hands kept you further from the edge. Finding a narrow bend in the river gave you a better view of incoming trouble. And in some rare cases, you might even find a naturally formed pool away from the main current. A prehistoric luxury spa, if you ignored the dead insects floating on top. There was no concept of boiling or filtering. If the water was clear, it was considered probably fine. If it was murky, you drank it anyway, and pretended the earthy flavor was intentional. Occasionally, this led to days of stomach cramps and other unpleasant consequences. But survival wasn't about comfort. It was about stacking the odds in your favor, one cautious sip at a time. And so, every drink was a gamble. Sometimes you walked away refreshed. Sometimes you walked away queasy. And sometimes you didn't walk away at all. But no matter the risks, water was life, and life rarely came without a few hidden teeth. In the prehistoric world, fashion wasn't about style. It was about whatever stuck to you overnight. The first outfit of the day was whatever dirt, leaves, and mystery substances you picked up while sleeping on the ground or wedged in a tree. Some mornings, you woke up wearing a patchwork of crushed grass and dried mud that could almost pass as camouflage, assuming you were trying to blend in with a compost heap. There were no animal skin cloaks, no carefully woven fabrics, and definitely no summer or winter wardrobe. If you happened to have a bit of fur left over from a kill, you might drape it around yourself for warmth. But more often than not, your only real layer was your own skin. And perhaps the occasional insect that decided you were an all-you-can-eat buffet. Seasonal changes were handled with the most advanced technology available at the time. Moving. If it got cold, you followed the sun. If it got too hot, you found shade. If it rained, you got wet. No one complained about soggy clothes because there weren't any to complain about. The idea of clean clothing didn't exist either. Washing yourself meant walking into a river and hoping the current did most of the work. Even then, 10 minutes later, you'd be covered in dust, pollen, or the contents of whatever fruit had exploded in your hands. Occasionally, body decoration appeared. Not for modesty, but for intimidation or personal amusement. Smearing yourself with clay could help keep insects at bay, though it also made you look like a confused statue. Rubbing crushed berries into your skin left streaks of red or purple, which might have been considered attractive, or possibly a sign that you'd been in a fight with a particularly juicy plant. Footwear? Not a chance. Your feet developed calluses thick enough to rival stone tools, but stepping on a sharp rock could still make even the most hardened hunter hop around like they'd just stepped on a Lego. And yet, despite the lack of fabrics, zippers, or even a vague sense of modesty, no one froze to death en masse or melted in the sun. The prehistoric dress code was simple. Wear what the environment gives you and hope it doesn't bite back. In the prehistoric world, everyone was on the neighborhood watch, whether they liked it or not. There were no locked doors, no fences, and no "beware of dog" signs. The only thing keeping predators at bay was your ability to notice them before they noticed you. The problem was, predators were everywhere. Some of them hunted at night, some in the day, and some just hung around waiting for you to make a mistake. Big cats liked to lurk in tall grass, blending in until the last possible second. Hyenas travelled in packs, laughing in a way that made you think they already knew how this story would end. And snakes, they didn't need to chase you, they just waited for you to step exactly where you shouldn't. There was no centralized alarm system, unless you counted the collective scream of the group when something lunged out of the bushes. This was often followed by frantic pointing, rock throwing, and the occasional self-sacrificial distraction from the bravest, or most unlucky, member of the band. Survival meant constant awareness. Your eyes were always scanning the trees for shadows that didn't belong, your ears straining for the sound of twigs snapping in the wrong direction. Every rustle could be a breeze, or something considering you as lunch. Group living was the only real defense. The more of you there were, the better your chances of spotting trouble early, and, if it came to it, of outrunning at least one other person. Cooperation was key, but so was self-preservation. The prehistoric social contract was simple. We protect each other, but if a leopard grabs you, that's between you and the leopard. Some groups even developed informal lookout roles, though these weren't glamorous positions. Standing on a rock to watch for danger mostly meant you'd be the first one spotted by danger. Still, the role had one perk. If you saw trouble coming in time, you might get a head start on running. And so the prehistoric neighborhood watch was an operation, staffed entirely by the unwilling, unpaid, and occasionally eaten. No one asked to be on the roster. You just were, from the moment you opened your eyes until the moment you closed them. Hopefully not forever. Before language evolved into the complex web of sounds, grammar, and sarcasm we have today, communication among early humans was minimalist. You didn't have the luxury of explaining yourself in detail. Instead, you relied on a combination of pointing, grunting, and facial expressions that could range from "look out" to "I think that berry is killing me." The system worked, most of the time. Pointing was the most versatile tool in the prehistoric vocabulary. You could point at food, at a predator, or at something vaguely interesting, though this often caused confusion. Point at a distant gazelle, and you might be suggesting a hunt. Point at a nearby bush, and someone might interpret it as "hide there," even if your actual meaning was "don't touch that, it's full of stinging insects." grunts were equally multi-purpose. A low, drawn-out "mmm" could mean food was good, or it could mean you were choking on it. A sharp might mean watch out, or it might mean that's mine. The only way to know for sure was to observe the speaker's eyebrows and hope for the best. Hand gestures filled in the gaps, though accuracy varied wildly. A wave could mean come here or go away, depending on the urgency. Flailing your arms might mean danger, or I'm on fire, or possibly there's a bug on me. This ambiguity kept life interesting, and occasionally shortened it. When things got truly urgent, the most reliable form of communication was screaming. A scream meant something bad was happening right now. It didn't matter if it was a predator, a rockfall, or stepping into a wasp nest. Everyone screamed, and everyone ran. The details could be sorted out later, assuming anyone was still around to share them. The lack of language also made social dynamics interesting. Negotiations over food were more like staring contests. Flirtation involved lingering glances, awkward noises, and maybe a shared piece of fruit if you were feeling bold. Arguments could escalate from grunts to shoving in seconds, often resolved by one party simply stomping away and sulking behind a tree. It wasn't eloquent, but it was effective enough. With nothing but noise, hands, and frantic pointing, early humans managed to share warnings, coordinate hunts, and occasionally insult each other. And really, what else do you need for a functioning society? Hunting, in theory, was simple. Find animal, kill animal, eat animal. In practice, it was more like find animal, scare animal, chase animal, get exhausted, and hope the animal trips over something before you do. There were no bows, no spears with metal tips, and definitely no clever traps built from blueprints. The main tools were rocks, sticks, and the occasional sharp piece of bone, all of which were just as likely to injure you as your target. Throwing a rock could be effective, if you happened to be close enough to touch the animal with your other hand. Otherwise, the rock was mostly a polite request for the prey to run faster. The first step of a hunt was spotting the target. Gazelles, antelopes, and small deer were ideal, not because they were easy to catch, but because they had meat worth the effort. The problem? They also had legs that could carry them out of sight in the time it took you to blink. Chasing them was a team sport. The fastest members of the group would start the pursuit, driving the animal toward others waiting ahead. Waiting was a generous term here. Mostly it meant standing in the general area and hoping to be in the right place when the prey got tired. Unfortunately, animals seemed to have far more stamina than humans, and they weren't above zigzagging through terrain that made you question why you'd gotten out of bed at all. When hunting smaller prey, like rabbits or lizards, the approach was sneakier. This involved crawling on your belly, moving so slowly that plants had time to grow around you. The reward was a quick burst of motion, hopefully yours, and the chance to grab the animal before it disappeared into a hole you couldn't fit into. Of course, not every hunt ended in triumph. Sometimes you came back with nothing but bruises, empty hands, and a story about how it got away this time. Other times, you found yourself being hunted instead. A reminder that chasing a wild boar was a great way to meet a wild boar's tusks. Still, even a small success could feed the group for a day, making the exhaustion worth it. And if you failed, well, there were always berries, assuming you hadn't learned the hard way which ones were the poisonous kind. If hunting was high risk, high reward, gathering was the prehistoric equivalent of clocking in for a safe but boring desk job. You weren't going to bring down a mammoth, but you also weren't going to be gored, mauled, or trampled. The worst that could happen was an itchy rash, unless you picked the wrong mushrooms, in which case you'd be seeing colours for the rest of the day, assuming you saw anything at all. Gathering was a group activity, usually done by those who didn't fancy sprinting after angry wildlife. The method was straightforward. Wander around, spot something edible looking, and hope your instincts, or someone else's previous survival, confirmed it wouldn't kill you. Plants with bright colours were suspicious. Plants that smelled bad were suspicious. Plants that looked delicious were suspicious too, because nature had a sense of humour. Berries were the most common find. If they were sweet, you'd eat them immediately. If they were bitter, you might still eat them immediately, because prehistoric hunger didn't allow for picky eating. Tubers and roots were another staple, though digging them up required the patience of a saint and fingernails made of stone. Nuts were a special prize, a high-calorie jackpot, but cracking them open without tools often turned into an impromptu dental exam. Seeds and edible leaves filled in the gaps, though no one looked excited while chewing on a handful of raw foliage. Occasionally, you'd get lucky and stumble upon honey, which was pure gold in the prehistoric diet. The only catch was that bees were also prehistoric, and their opinions on sharing were firm and delivered with stingers. Gatherers weren't entirely safe from danger. Snakes loved hiding in bushes. Wild pigs sometimes took offense at humans stealing their snacks. And once in a while, another group of humans would wander by, eye your basket, and decide they were hungrier than you were. Still, gathering had its perks. You could chat, via grunts and gestures, while working, keep an eye on the kids, and avoid sprinting across plains in a desperate attempt to bring home dinner. Best of all, when the hunters returned empty-handed, the gatherer's haul was suddenly the main course, and no one cared that it was just a pile of roots and berries. In the great prehistoric survival plan, gathering wasn't glamorous, but it was reliable. And in a world where reliability often meant life or death, that made you the quiet heroes of the tribe. Finding shelter in the prehistoric world wasn't about comfort. It was about staying alive long enough to complain about the lack of comfort. The definition of home was flexible. Sometimes it was a shallow cave. Sometimes it was the space under a leaning tree. And sometimes it was just a rock big enough to hide behind while you pretended it was a wall. Caves were the top-tier option. They provided shade, protection from rain, and at least one solid wall you didn't have to build yourself. The downside? They were usually already occupied by something with more teeth than you. Negotiating ownership involved a complex strategy. Yelling, waving sticks, and running away when the current resident didn't seem impressed. If caves were unavailable, overhangs and hollowed-out trees became prime real estate. They didn't offer the same level of protection, but they were better than lying in the open, where the only roof was the occasional bird flying overhead, sometimes leaving a surprise you didn't ask for. The truly desperate option was making your own shelter. This meant stacking branches, leaves, and mud into something vaguely tent-shaped. It wasn't pretty, and it definitely wasn't waterproof, but it gave the comforting illusion of security. If the wind blew too hard, you might wake up with your roof in another time zone, but at least you tried. Placement mattered too. Building your shelter too close to a river was an invitation for flooding, or a nighttime visit from crocodiles. Setting up on a hill meant better drainage, but also more wind and fewer places to hide if trouble arrived. Finding the perfect spot was a delicate balance between safety and not freezing to death. Inside, furnishings consisted of whatever was soft enough to sit or lie on without spraining something. Piles of grass worked, as long as you didn't mind the bugs moving in with you. Flat rocks could double as seats, tables, or weapons if necessary. And lighting, that came courtesy of the sun, or the moon, if you were unlucky enough to still be awake. In short, prehistoric shelter was never about luxury. It was about putting something between you and the weather, and hoping that something didn't collapse, blow away, or bite you in the night. Fire was the prehistoric equivalent of a smartphone. Once you had it, you wondered how you ever lived without it, and once you lost it, you panicked. The problem? Unlike smartphones, you couldn't just turn it back on. Fire had to be stolen from nature, coaxed into life, and guarded like it was your only child, because in a way, it was. Most people first encountered fire after a lightning strike, when the sky decided to drop a flaming tree into the middle of the savannah. The brave, or the reckless, would rush in to snatch a burning branch before the flames died out. This was often followed by frantic running, yelling, and shaking the branch to avoid becoming part of the fire yourself. Once you had fire, keeping it alive became the tribe's #1 priority. You couldn't make more, at least not until someone accidentally figured out that rubbing sticks together really fast could work. Until then, the fire was like a grumpy pet that refused to feed itself. Someone had to watch it constantly, feeding it wood, protecting it from rain, and making sure no one tripped and fell into it. The benefits were worth the trouble. Fire cooked food, which made it tastier and less likely to kill you. It scared away predators, or at least made them think twice before charging. And on cold nights, it kept you from shivering yourself into an early grave. But fire also had a dark side. Get too close, and you'd learn the meaning of pain in a very direct, sizzling way. Forget to watch it, and the entire savannah could go up in flames, taking your shelter, your food, and possibly your eyebrows with it. Socially, fire became the center of everything. People gathered around it to eat, talk, and occasionally stare at it like it was performing magic, because to them, it was. The flames danced, the wood cracked, and for a moment, life felt almost civilized. Keeping the fire alive wasn't just survival, it was prestige. Whoever controlled the flames controlled comfort, safety, and dinner, which meant if the fire went out on your watch, you might want to start running before everyone else realized. In the prehistoric world, predators weren't something you saw on a nature documentary. They were something you saw when you woke up in the middle of the night and realized something was breathing just a little too close. There were no fences, no firearms, and no animal control officers to call. If you wanted to survive, you had to know who might eat you and how to make sure they didn't. The lineup was impressive. Big cats were the worst. Sleek, silent, and faster than you on your best day. They could sneak up so quietly that your only warning might be the sound of someone else screaming. Hyenas were next on the list, coming in packs with jaws strong enough to bite through bones, and the unsettling habit of laughing about it. Crocodiles waited patiently in rivers, pretending to be logs until you got close enough for a surprise death roll. Then there were snakes, some venomous, some constricting, and all of them experts at being exactly where you didn't want them to be. Even birds got in on the action. Giant raptors could swoop down and carry off smaller humans, which made for a bad day for the victim and a very awkward evening for the rest of the group. Avoiding predators was an all-day, everyday job. You learned to scan the horizon, listen for unusual silences, and assume that if you couldn't see danger, it was probably right behind you. Sleeping in groups helped, though it also meant you were statistically more likely to be woken up by someone else's panic than by the actual predator. Sometimes the best defense was offense, yelling, throwing rocks, or waving sticks to convince the predator you weren't worth the effort. This worked better in large groups. Alone, it was basically just a dramatic way to say goodbye. Despite the constant danger, humans adapted. We learned patterns, which rivers hid crocodiles, which bushes hid snakes, which trees were good for climbing in emergencies. Survival was less about fighting and more about not being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if all else failed, you just had to be faster than the slowest person in your group. Harsh, yes. But in the prehistoric world, morality often took a back seat to making it through the night. Parenting in the prehistoric world was not about piano lessons, bedtime stories, or packing school lunches. It was about keeping your offspring alive long enough for them to learn how not to die on their own. That was the entire curriculum. Survival 101. From birth, prehistoric babies came into the world with one major flaw. They were loud. Loud enough to attract predators from impressive distances. You couldn't shush them with a pacifier because those didn't exist, and you couldn't put them in a crib because cribs hadn't been invented yet. Your only option was to carry them everywhere, and hope your glare could convince them to stop broadcasting your location. Carrying a child wasn't as simple as it sounds. You had no stroller, no baby sling, and no ergonomic carrier. You had arms, and if you were lucky, a strip of animal hide to tie them to your back. This meant that every task, from gathering food to climbing a tree to avoid a leopard, had to be done with a small human clinging to you like a particularly needy backpack. Teaching began early. Toddlers were shown what berries to eat, how to throw rocks, and where not to wander. Lessons were usually hands-on, and occasionally involved watching another child make a terrible mistake and learning from it. The "don't touch that snake" lesson usually only needed to be taught once. Discipline was straightforward. If you misbehaved, you got a sharp look, a firm word, or a tap. But mostly, the consequences were natural. Refuse to follow the group? You'd find yourself alone. Ignore the warnings about the river? The crocodiles would provide feedback. The harsh environment was the ultimate parenting partner. Childhood didn't last long. By the time a kid could walk steadily, they were expected to contribute. Carrying sticks for the fire, helping with gathering, scaring birds away from drying meat. These were the prehistoric chores. Complaining wasn't really an option because no dinner wasn't a threat. It was the logical outcome of not helping. Despite the constant danger, prehistoric parenting had its rewards. Watching your child manage their first solo berry-picking trip or seeing them successfully avoid being eaten gave you a rare sense of pride. And if they made it to adulthood, you'd know you'd done your job. At least until they started producing loud, fragile little humans of their own. In the prehistoric world, disagreements happened. Maybe someone took your favorite sitting rock. Maybe they ate more than their share of the roasted lizard. Or maybe they gave you a funny look while you were gnawing on a mammoth bone. Whatever the cause, conflicts were inevitable, and the solutions were uncomplicated. Option 1. Fists. When tempers flared, there was no formal debate, no arbitration, and definitely no "let's talk about our feelings." Instead, you'd get a short burst of shouting, more like aggressive grunting, followed by a very physical exchange of opinions. These fights were quick, brutal, and almost never decided anything beyond who was going to need a new front tooth. Option 2. Rocks. Rocks were the prehistoric multi-tool, useful for hunting, building, cracking nuts, and, in moments of anger, convincing someone to see your point of view, preferably from a safe distance. Throwing a rock was a clear escalation, though. Once the first rock flew, the discussion was officially over, and everyone in the area knew it. The rest of the group would step back, partly to avoid getting hit, and partly to enjoy the show. Option 3. Running away. By far the most underrated conflict resolution method, running spared you from injuries, grudges, and the possibility of becoming an accidental snack for a predator drawn by the noise. Of course, running away came with its own risks, namely, looking like a coward. But in prehistoric terms, a living coward was still better than a dead hero. Sometimes disputes were resolved indirectly. The group's elders, those who had managed to survive long enough to be considered wise, would step in, not because they were particularly fair, but because fights risked injury, and injured people slowed everyone down. Their mediation style was straightforward. They told both parties to shut up and go find food. In the absence of formal laws, the real consequence of starting too many fights was social isolation. If no one wanted to hunt or gather with you, your chances of survival dropped faster than a rock aimed at your head. So, while prehistoric conflict resolution might not have been elegant, it was effective in its own way. The choices were simple, the outcomes clear, and if you lived to tell the story, you'd probably think twice before starting the next one. Migration wasn't a seasonal vacation, it was a desperate necessity. When the food ran out, the water dried up, or the predators got a little too comfortable hanging around camp, the solution was simple. Pack up everything you owned, which was basically a stick, a rock, and whatever you were wearing, and start walking. There was no, "Are we there yet?" because no one knew where there was. The decision to move was made collectively, though collectively usually meant the oldest, grumpiest member of the group saying, "We can't stay here, everything is dead," and everyone else agreeing. The actual journey was slow, really slow. Children had short legs, the elderly had sore knees, and someone was always stopping to pick berries, check animal tracks, or complain about blisters. Progress was measured in how far until the next shade tree, not in miles. Carrying belongings was another challenge. With no backpacks, your best bet was to bundle your possessions in animal hides or balance them awkwardly on your head. If you had a baby, congratulations, you were now a mobile crib. If you had extra food, you were everyone's best friend, until it ran out. Food along the way was hit or miss. Some days you stumbled upon a lucky find, a bush full of berries, a dead animal that still looked edible, and other days you went to bed with an empty stomach, cursing every plant you passed for not being food. Water was even trickier. You either found a clean source, or you drank from a muddy puddle and hoped for the best. Then there was the weather. Migration could mean walking under a scorching sun, shivering through cold winds, or getting drenched in sudden downpours. You learned quickly that perfect weather didn't exist, only less bad weather. Eventually, after days or weeks of walking, you'd find a new spot that seemed promising. There'd be water, food sources, and maybe a cave that didn't have anything currently living in it. You'd set up camp, sigh in relief, and start telling yourself this was the perfect place to settle down forever. Of course, forever in prehistoric terms usually meant until the food runs out again. For prehistoric humans, survival wasn't an occasional challenge. It was the full-time, unpaid, no days off job everyone had. You didn't prepare for emergencies, because every single day was an emergency. There was no concept of comfort beyond not currently being eaten, and no luxury higher than having a full belly and all your limbs. Survival wasn't just about reacting to danger, it was baked into every choice you made. Which berries you picked, where you built your shelter, how far you wandered from the group. Each decision was a delicate balance between finding resources and becoming resources for something else. Social bonds were part of the strategy. Alone, you were an appetizer. In a group, you were part of a noisy, unpredictable herd that could scare off predators and share the workload. Sure, living with other people meant constant bickering over food, sleeping space, and who got the driest spot by the fire, but the trade-off was worth it. Even the most annoying member of the group might one day be the person who spotted the leopard before it spotted you. Food storage was almost non-existent, so eat when you can was a core philosophy. This meant feasts when the hunt was successful and miserable foraging when it wasn't. There was no long-term security, just a constant cycle of finding, consuming, and searching again. Adaptability was the real secret. Weather changed, rivers dried up, herds moved on, and suddenly your perfect camp became a death trap. In the prehistoric world, stubbornness was a shortcut to extinction, while flexibility, even if it meant abandoning your favorite sitting rock, kept you alive. Even leisure had a survival angle. Storytelling around the fire wasn't just entertainment. It was a way to pass on crucial knowledge. A tale about a great warrior who ignored warning signs and wandered into a swamp wasn't just drama. It was a reminder to stay out of swamps unless you enjoyed leeches and quicksand. In short, survival wasn't an event. It was the culture, the economy, the religion, and the daily routine all rolled into one. And while prehistoric humans didn't know it at the time, their relentless grind through danger, hunger, and hardship was the reason we're here. Sitting comfortably, watching a video about them, Theodora's life began not in the marble corridors of power, but in the noisy, chaotic underbelly of Constantinople, the Hippodrome district. Born around the year 500, she was the daughter of a bear trainer employed by the Greens, one of the city's famed chariot racing factions. Her father's job was dangerous and unpredictable. One slip in the arena, and a wild animal could end a man's life in an instant. Theodora's earliest memories would have been filled with the sounds of roaring crowds, the clatter of hooves on stone, and the ever-present smell of sweat, animals, and dust. Tragedy struck when her father died suddenly, leaving the family without its main source of income. In the Byzantine Empire, widowhood for a lower-class woman was a precarious position. There was no safety net, no guaranteed support. Theodora's mother, determined to keep her daughters from destitution, remarried quickly to another man within the Hippodrome's service. Yet the new stepfather's influence was limited, and survival for the family meant navigating the brutal realities of the city's poorer quarters. From an early age, Theodora learned how fragile life could be. Poverty was not an abstract fear. It was the air she breathed. She would have seen beggars sleeping under porticos, orphaned children selling scraps, and market stalls where every coin was fought over. In such a world, beauty and cleverness were not luxuries. They were tools. And Theodora, even as a girl, began honing them. She also grew up in the shadow of the Hippodrome's political chaos. The rival chariot factions, the Blues and the Greens, were more than sports teams. They were power blocks that could make or break careers. Their influence extended from the racetrack into the streets, the marketplaces, and even the imperial palace. A child of the Greens, Theodora would have learned early on where loyalties lay, and how dangerous it could be to cross the wrong faction. These formative years gave her something no noble upbringing could: an unflinching view of life's harshness and a survival instinct sharpened by necessity. She was not raised to expect privilege. She was raised to seize opportunity when it appeared, no matter the cost. In the years to come, those instincts would carry her far from the Hippodrome's noise and dirt, into the very heart of Byzantine power. But for now, Theodora was just a girl on the city's margins, watching, learning, and quietly preparing for a life no one could have imagined for her. In Constantinople, the theatre was not a place of refined art for the masses. It was a battleground of wit, beauty, and shameless spectacle. For a girl like Theodora, whose family had little to offer but her looks and quick tongue, the stage offered a path to survival. It was a dangerous one, but it was a way forward. By her early teens, she had become an actress in the Hippodrome's associated theatres, performing in pantomimes and comedic skits. These were not polite tragedies in the style of ancient Greece. They were bawdy, often scandalous performances where humour was laced with innuendo and the audience was quick to boo or cheer. The line between entertainer and courtesan was thin, and Theodora, like many actresses of the time, likely supplemented her meagre earnings with the favors of wealthy patrons. To the aristocracy, such women were dismissed as morally corrupt. But to Theodora, the theatre was an education. Here, she learned how to read a crowd, how to draw their eyes, hold their attention, and turn their mood with a gesture or a smile. She mastered the art of timing, both on stage and off. In the ruthless social order of Constantinople, charm was a weapon, and Theodora wielded it with increasing skill. Her beauty became the talk of the city's lower and middle classes, but so did her sharp tongue. She was no passive ornament. Theodora had a talent for conversation that could flatter, tease, or humiliate in equal measure. This made her alluring to some and dangerous to others. She moved in circles where powerful men came seeking distraction, and she learned to listen closely when they spoke. Political gossip, whispered in the glow of lamplight, was just as valuable as coin. Yet the life of an actress was unstable. Rivalries could be deadly, and the fickle tastes of the crowd could end a career overnight. Theodora knew she could not stay in this world forever, but she also knew that every night on stage, every encounter with a wealthy patron, was a stepping stone. She was not merely surviving, she was studying, preparing. And in time, her ambition would pull her far beyond the theatre's flickering oil lamps, toward a destiny no one in those smoky playhouses could have imagined. Theodora's rise from the stage to the palace was not a straight climb. It was interrupted by scandal, exile, and a complete reinvention of herself. Sometime in her late teens, Theodora left Constantinople under circumstances the chroniclers record with salacious detail and more than a little bias. According to Procopius, who would later become one of her most famous detractors, she became the mistress of a Byzantine official who was posted to North Africa. When their relationship soured, Theodora found herself abandoned in a foreign land, with no money, no allies, and no clear way home. For most women in her position, this would have been the end of the story. But Theodora was not most women. Stranded, she began to work her way back to the capital by passing through various cities across the eastern Mediterranean. In Alexandria, she is said to have come under the influence of a Christian ascetic who helped her reframe her life and ambitions. Whether this was truly a dramatic religious conversion or a strategic rebranding, the effect was the same. Theodora emerged with a new sense of purpose and a refined image. Gone was the flamboyant actress known for daring performances and risque humor. In her place was a woman presenting herself as modest, pious, and intelligent. She traded the gaudy costumes of the stage for simpler, dignified clothing. She cultivated a reputation for generosity toward the poor and compassion toward the vulnerable, especially women trapped in the same kind of precarious life she had once led. By the time she reached Antioch, she was no longer merely surviving on her looks or wit. She was carefully positioning herself for a different kind of future. Her circle began to include influential merchants, court officials, and clergy. Whispers of her transformation began to reach Constantinople, and her name was spoken not just in the smoky corners of taverns, but in the quieter corridors of power. When Theodora finally returned to the capital, she was not the same girl who had left. She carried herself with the poise of someone who had seen the wider empire, endured its dangers, and learned how to turn setbacks into leverage. The stage had given her performance skills. Exile had given her resilience. Now, both would serve her as she stepped into the most pivotal chapter of her life, meeting the man who would make her empress. When Theodora returned to Constantinople, she was no longer a struggling performer or a discarded mistress. She was a woman with a refined image, a sharp mind, and an unshakable sense of purpose. It was in this transformed state that she caught the attention of a man whose own ambitions matched her own, Justinian, the powerful nephew and heir to Emperor Justin III. Theodora and Justinian's first meeting is lost to history, but contemporary accounts agree it was no ordinary courtship. By the time they encountered each other, Justinian was already a rising star in the imperial court, a man of intense focus, legal genius, and relentless drive. He was known for surrounding himself with capable people, but few could match Theodora's intelligence and charisma. She was more than beautiful. She was compelling, a conversationalist who could hold her own in matters of politics, law, and theology, in an era when women of her background were often dismissed or used and discarded. Theodora stood out. Justinian saw in her not only a partner, but an ally who understood the complex currents of power and influence. Theodora, for her part, recognized in Justinian a man who could open the gates to a world she had long been studying from the outside. Their relationship, however, faced a significant obstacle. Byzantine law forbade high-ranking officials from marrying actresses or former courtesans. To the conservative elite, Theodora's past made her an unsuitable match for a future emperor. But Justinian was not a man to let tradition dictate his choices. He pushed for a change in the law, persuading his uncle to pass legislation that allowed such marriages. This reform, subtle on paper, was monumental in practice. It was a direct challenge to the entrenched prejudices of the Byzantine aristocracy. With the legal barrier removed, Theodora and Justinian married around 525. The wedding marked the beginning of a partnership that would redefine imperial rule in the Eastern Roman Empire. Theodora was not content to be a decorative empress. From the start, she made it clear she intended to govern alongside her husband. In the eyes of many in the court, this union was scandalous. To Theodora, it was destiny fulfilled. She had crossed the gulf from the hippodrome's dusty outskirts to the heart of the Byzantine throne room, and she was only getting started. The marriage of Theodora and Justinian was more than a personal union. It was a political alliance that would soon place them at the pinnacle of the Byzantine Empire. In 527, Emperor Justin III, aging and in poor health, formally crowned his nephew as co-emperor. Just months later, Justin died, leaving Justinian as sole ruler. By his side, Theodora was elevated to the rank of Augusta, the highest title an empress could hold. Her coronation was not a passive affair. Chroniclers noted that she wore imperial purple with a confidence that rivaled Justinian's own presence. From the beginning, she did not stand behind him. She stood beside him, sharing the dais, the ceremonies, and, most importantly, the responsibilities of rule. For many in the court, this was unprecedented. Theodora was no mere figurehead. She was a co-sovereign in all but name. Theodora quickly made her influence felt. She sat in on council meetings, advised on matters of state, and had a direct hand in shaping imperial policy. Her life before the throne had given her an uncommon empathy for society's most vulnerable, and she urged Justinian to enact laws that protected women, particularly in cases of forced prostitution, property rights, and guardianship of children. She also worked to improve the status of actresses, banning certain exploitative practices that had been common in her youth. Her rise, however, was met with hostility from the entrenched aristocracy. Many in the Senate still saw her as a woman of low birth and questionable morality, unworthy of sharing power with the emperor. Procopius, the court historian, would later pen his infamous Secret History, painting Theodora as manipulative, vindictive, and cruel, an account steeped in political bias. Whether these accusations were grounded in truth or simply in resentment, they reveal how deeply she unsettled the traditional order. But Theodora was not easily intimidated. She understood the importance of symbolism and spectacle in Byzantine politics. Every public appearance reinforced her authority, from elaborate processions through the streets of Constantinople to the lavish ceremonies of the Hagia Sophia. She cultivated an image of regal dignity, tempered by a reputation for sharp wit and unwavering resolve. By the time Justinian's reign was fully underway, Theodora had secured her position not only as empress, but as an indispensable partner in the governance of the empire. And soon, she would face the first great test of that power, one that would determine whether she was truly fit to wear the crown. In January of 532, Constantinople erupted into one of the most violent uprisings in its history, the Nika Revolt. What began as a dispute between the city's two great chariot factions, the Blues and the Greens, spiraled into a full-scale rebellion against Justinian's rule. The factions, normally bitter enemies, united under a single cry, Nika, meaning victory, and turned the hippodrome into a rallying point for tens of thousands of furious citizens. The grievances were many: high taxes, corruption, and unpopular legal reforms. But in the streets, the rebellion took on a life of its own. Rioters set fire to entire districts, looted shops, and stormed government buildings. Within days, much of Constantinople was in flames, including the original church of Hagia Sophia. Inside the palace, panic reigned. Justinian's advisors urged him to flee by sea to save his life, abandoning the capital to the mob. The emperor himself wavered, knowing that staying could mean capture or death. It was then that Theodora delivered the speech that would define her legacy. In words recorded by chroniclers, she told the court, "If flight were the only means of safety, still I would not flee. Those who have worn the crown should never survive its loss. For me, the royal purple is the noblest shroud." Her message was clear. She would rather die as an empress than live in disgrace. Her unshakable resolve shamed the waverers and stiffened Justinian's spine. The decision was made. They would fight for the throne. Under Theodora's influence, Justinian summoned his most loyal generals, Belisarius and Mundus, to crush the revolt. Using a mix of deception and force, they lured the rioters back into the hippodrome. Once the entrances were sealed, imperial troops poured in, slaughtering the rebels in a brutal massacre. Contemporary sources claim that as many as 30,000 people were killed in a single day. The aftermath was grim, but the rebellion was over. Justinian remained on the throne, his authority restored, and Theodora's reputation as a fearless leader cemented. She had not only saved her husband's reign, but had proven to the empire and to its enemies that she was no ornament of power. She was its protector. With the Nika revolt crushed and her authority solidified, Theodora turned her attention to causes close to her heart. She had not forgotten the hardships of her youth: poverty, exploitation, and the lack of protection for women in Byzantine society. Now, as empress, she was in a position to change those conditions through law. Working alongside Justinian, Theodora championed reforms that transformed the legal landscape for women. She pushed for legislation that made it illegal to force women into prostitution, a common fate for those abandoned or in debt. She funded a large refuge in Constantinople, the House of Repentance, where former prostitutes could live, receive food, and learn new trades. For Theodora, this was not charity in the abstract. It was a lifeline she wished she had seen more of in her early life. She also advanced property and inheritance rights for women, ensuring that widows could keep their dowries and that daughters could inherit wealth in the absence of male heirs. Guardianship laws were reformed to protect children and prevent abuses by relatives seeking control of family estates. Divorce laws, previously stacked heavily in favor of men, were modified to allow women greater legal recourse in cases of abuse or neglect. Theodora's advocacy extended beyond the palace walls. She worked to curb the power of corrupt provincial governors, many of whom exploited their subjects, particularly women. She dispatched imperial inspectors to investigate complaints and demanded accountability. Such actions won her admiration among the lower classes and resentment among the aristocracy, who viewed her interference as an affront to their authority. In foreign policy, she even used her position to aid vulnerable groups. When the Persian Empire persecuted members of the Monophysite Christian sect, a minority often opposed by the Orthodox establishment, Theodora offered them refuge in Byzantine territory. This act reflected both her personal convictions and her political skill in balancing competing religious factions. Though Procopius and other detractors would later portray her as calculating and ruthless, even they could not ignore the scale of her influence on the empire's laws. For the women of Byzantium, Theodora's reign represented a rare moment when the corridors of power were open to their concerns. Her reforms did not erase inequality, but they shifted the balance, proving that an empress could be more than a ceremonial figure. She could be a voice for those who had none. Theodora's role in the Byzantine Empire was not confined to philanthropy or legal reform. She was deeply enmeshed in the high-stakes political chess game that defined Justinian's reign. From her place beside the emperor, she navigated court intrigue, foreign diplomacy, and religious disputes with the same sharp instincts that had once helped her survive the streets of Constantinople. The imperial court was a battlefield without swords, where words, alliances, and rumors could elevate or destroy a career. Theodora excelled at identifying threats early and neutralizing them before they grew. She maintained her own network of informants, ensuring she knew what was being whispered in the Senate chambers, the marketplaces, and even in the private homes of rival nobles. Those who underestimated her often found themselves quietly removed from positions of influence, or publicly disgraced. Religious politics were a constant source of tension in the empire, and Theodora played a decisive role. While Justinian sought to unify the Christian Church under Orthodox doctrine, Theodora maintained strong ties to the Monophysite faction, offering them protection and sometimes acting as their advocate at court. This created a delicate balance between the imperial couple. Some saw it as a political liability, others as a clever way of keeping both sides tethered to the throne. In foreign affairs, Theodora could be as shrewd as any general. She corresponded with foreign rulers, including the Persian queen and other women of influence across the empire's borders, using these channels to secure alliances or soften hostilities. Unlike many rulers of the era, she understood the power of personal diplomacy, particularly among queens and empresses who shared the unique burdens of leadership in male-dominated courts. Her political maneuvers were not without enemies. Procopius's Secret History, a work dripping with venom, painted her as manipulative, vindictive, and even cruel. Whether exaggerated or rooted in fact, these accusations reveal just how much fear and resentment she inspired among the empire's elite. They were unused to an empress wielding such direct influence over policy and personnel. Yet Theodora's political acumen was undeniable. She could be ruthless when necessary, but she could also be magnanimous when it served the empire's stability. In an age when women were expected to rule only from behind the scenes, Theodora ruled in plain sight, and she did it on her own terms. By the mid-540s, Theodora's formidable presence at court began to wane, not because of scandal or political defeat, but because of illness. Sources differ on the nature of her sickness. Some suggest cancer, others a lingering infection. Whatever the cause, it gradually weakened her. though she refused to withdraw entirely from state affairs. Even in failing health, she continued to advise Justinian, meeting with envoys, issuing orders, and pressing for the completion of her legal and charitable projects. For Justinian, her decline was a personal as well as political blow. Their partnership had been more than a marriage. It was a shared rule. Theodora had stood beside him through riots, wars, and reforms, often shaping the empire's course as much as he had. As her condition worsened, the emperor ensured she remained surrounded by the finest physicians and attended by the court's inner circle. In 548, Theodora died at the age of 48. Her passing shook Constantinople. Even her enemies could not deny that she had left an indelible mark on the empire. Justinian, grief-stricken, buried her in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the imperial mausoleum where generations of emperors and empresses lay. Her tomb was given the honor and grandeur befitting a ruler in her own right. Her death did not erase her influence. Many of the reforms she championed, protections for women, anti-trafficking laws and property rights, remained in place for centuries, shaping Byzantine society long after her reign. She had altered not only policy, but also the perception of what an empress could be. In the years that followed, her image was immortalized in art and architecture. The most famous depiction still survives today in the glittering mosaics of the Basilica of San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy. There, she stands beside Justinian, robed in imperial purple, crowned and haloed, not behind him, but at his side. It is a fitting image for a woman who refused to be relegated to the background. Theodora's life remains a study in contrasts, from the dust of the hippodrome to the marble halls of the great palace, from the stigma of the stage to the reverence of sainthood in some Christian traditions. She was ambitious, shrewd, compassionate, and, at times, merciless. Above all, she was unforgettable, a woman who shaped the destiny of the Byzantine Empire and secured her place among history's most remarkable rulers. In the early medieval centuries, noble gatherings were anything but restrained. Banquets were raucous spectacles, long trestle tables groaning under the weight of roasted game, spiced wine flowing freely, and the air thick with the noise of minstrels, laughter, and the occasional drunken argument. Dancing certainly took place, but it was spontaneous and unrefined. Guests would leap up when the mood struck, forming loose circles or pairs, stamping and swaying to whatever tune the musicians happened to strike. Movement was dictated more by enthusiasm than by elegance, but by the late Middle Ages, this world was changing. The courts of Europe were becoming more sophisticated, influenced by the ideals of chivalry and the growing emphasis on refined behavior among the aristocracy. Nobility was no longer measured solely by wealth or military prowess. It was also displayed through cultured manners, graceful movement, and the ability to participate in the elaborate rituals of court life. Dancing, once a rustic diversion, became a stage for demonstrating breeding and social rank. This transformation was tied to the rise of centralized courts, where kings, dukes, and princes gathered their vassals under one roof, not just for governance, but for constant displays of pageantry. Life in these courts demanded careful observation of etiquette, and every social interaction, whether at the table, in the hunt, or on the dance floor, was an opportunity to assert one's position. The dance floor, in particular, became a microcosm of court society. To dance well was to show discipline, poise, and an understanding of the subtle language of gesture and movement. Every bow, turn, and hand placement was deliberate, carrying layers of meaning. A well-executed step could signal confidence, deference, flirtation, or even political alliance. Musicians, too, adapted to this new refinement. Instead of the rowdy tunes of earlier centuries, they composed measured, rhythmic pieces designed for specific choreographies. This gave rise to the idea of the dance master, a professional who trained nobles in the latest steps and ensured they would not embarrass themselves before royalty. By the 14th and 15th centuries, dancing was no longer an unstructured release of energy. It had become an art form, as codified and rule-bound as the heraldry that adorned the noble's shield. Courtly dance was elegance made visible, a graceful conversation without words, in which every participant knew their role. And for those who wished to climb the intricate ladder of court favour, mastering it was not optional. Among the many dances that flourished in the refined courts of late medieval Europe, none symbolised the shift toward elegance more clearly than the bass dance, literally, the low dance. Originating in the courts of Burgundy in the 15th century, it was the polar opposite of the leaping, stomping and spinning common in earlier medieval celebrations. The bass dance was slow, deliberate and gliding, a display of grace rather than vigour. The low in its name referred not to social rank, but to the movement of the body. The feet remained close to the ground, the knees bent slightly, creating a flowing, almost weightless appearance. Partners would advance and retreat in smooth, measured steps, their upper bodies held perfectly upright. The goal was to seem as if one were floating across the floor, never hurried, never unbalanced. In an age where physical poise was linked to noble breeding, this style of movement sent a powerful message. Music for the bass dance was equally measured. It was performed in a slow duple or triple meter, often by ensembles of shawms, sackbuts, lutes or harps. A tenor line, steady and unchanging, provided the rhythmic foundation, while other instruments wove ornamented melodies above it. This structure allowed dancers to move in perfect time, their choreography predetermined and rehearsed to perfection. The bass dance also played a key role in courtly romance. Its unhurried pace and formal patterns created opportunities for prolonged eye contact, subtle gestures, and polite conversation. In the rigid etiquette of court life, it was one of the few sanctioned settings where a nobleman and lady could share a measured intimacy without scandal. The steps themselves often mirrored the language of chivalric love, approaching, retreating, circling, like a ritualized courtship. Mastering the bass dance required more than memorizing steps. It demanded control, posture, and an understanding of timing. A misstep could disrupt the entire set and humiliate the dancer in front of the court. For this reason, noble families employed dance masters to train their sons and daughters, ensuring they could perform flawlessly when summoned to the floor. By the late 15th century, the bass dance had become a hallmark of refined gatherings across France, Burgundy, and Italy. It was more than a dance. It was a declaration of social standing, an unspoken statement that one belonged in the highest circles of medieval society. As the 15th century gave way to the early 16th, the pavane emerged as the next great symbol of courtly elegance. If the bass dance was graceful, the pavane was regal. Originating in Italy, its name possibly derived from Padovana, meaning from Padua, it quickly spread to the courts of France, Spain, and England. The pavan was not simply a dance. It was a processional display, a living tapestry of silk, jewels, and heraldry moving to music. Performed at the opening of grand events, weddings, coronations, diplomatic receptions, it allowed the nobility to parade their wealth and status in a setting where every eye was upon them. The dancers moved in slow, stately steps, often in long lines or pairs, advancing and retreating with measured precision. Like the bass dance, the pavane demanded upright posture, but here the emphasis was on grandeur. The pace was so deliberate that each step became a moment to be savoured, each turn an opportunity to display the fall of a brocaded sleeve or the glint of a jewelled chain. The music for the pavan was rich and layered, often written in duple time. Lutes, viols, and early keyboard instruments like the virginals or harpsichord created a smooth, dignified soundscape. The choreography mirrored the musical phrasing, with steps often grouped in 4s or 8s, giving the dance a sense of inevitability, like a ceremonial march rather than a spontaneous expression. Socially, the pavan served as a public stage for hierarchy. The order of dancers often reflected the rank of participants, with royalty and the highest nobles at the front, followed by lesser lords and ladies. Even the smallest details, who partnered with whom, the placement in line, the richness of costume, were calculated signals of influence and favour. The pavan also carried a romantic undertone. Though more formal than the Bass dance, it still allowed moments of subtle interaction between partners. A hand held a fraction longer, a glance exchanged in perfect rhythm with the music. In the codified language of courtly love, these small gestures could speak volumes. By the height of its popularity, the pavan had become an indispensable part of noble life. It was the embodiment of pageantry, slow, deliberate, and dazzling. In every step and turn, it proclaimed that the late medieval court was not merely a place of politics, but a stage where power was performed as much as it was wielded. In the late medieval court, dancing was never just about music or movement. It was a form of politics in silk slippers. The dance floor served as a carefully controlled arena where alliances could be forged, rivalries managed, and affections signalled without a single word being spoken. Invitations to dance were far from casual. For a nobleman, asking a particular lady to join him could be an overture of courtship, or a calculated move to align himself with her family's influence. For a lady, accepting or declining was equally strategic. A refusal could signal disapproval, disinterest, or political distancing. A gracious acceptance, on the other hand, could soften tensions or cement an alliance. In a world where public image mattered as much as private intentions, the choice of partner was itself a public statement. The arrangement of dancers also reflected the subtleties of hierarchy. High-ranking nobles always occupied the most visible spots on the floor, often leading the first set of the evening. Lower-ranking courtiers waited their turn, hoping for an opportunity to be noticed. To be invited into a prominent position was a mark of favour. To be excluded was a quiet humiliation. Dance masters were keenly aware of this dynamic and often acted as silent facilitators of political choreography. They might subtly place certain individuals together to encourage conversation or separate others to avoid public scandal. The sequence of dances during an evening could be structured to allow key figures to interact just enough to intrigue the court without provoking gossip, or, depending on the host's aims, to stir it deliberately. For younger nobles, dancing was also a rehearsal for future diplomacy. The balance of deference and confidence required on the floor mirrored the skills needed at the negotiating table. One had to listen to the music, read the room, anticipate a partner's moves and respond with grace. Missteps, literal or figurative, could linger in memory far longer than the dance itself. And then there was the language of gesture. A deeper bow than usual, a slight squeeze of the hand during a turn, a smile offered at an unexpected moment. These could be tokens of affection or signals of intent. The court was a place where romance and politics intertwined, and the dance floor was one of its most elegant battlegrounds. Here, every movement was meaningful, every partner a potential ally or adversary, and every evening's performance another chapter in the silent diplomacy of the medieval elite. Behind the elegance of the late medieval dance floor stood an often overlooked figure, the dance master. These professionals were not mere instructors. They were custodians of etiquette, choreographers of spectacle, and, in many ways, silent architects of courtly politics. Without them, the noble art of dancing would have been little more than a tangle of missteps. Dance masters travelled from court to court, offering their expertise to rulers eager to maintain the latest fashions in movement. They were skilled not only in the steps themselves, but also in music, posture, and deportment. Their lessons went far beyond teaching a pavan or bassa dance. They moulded their pupils into living embodiments of grace, ensuring that every bow, turn, and gesture reflected the dignity of the rank they held. Instruction was rigorous. Students practiced for hours to perfect their timing, foot placement, and the delicate balance between formal restraint and expressive flair. A noble who stumbled or broke posture on the floor risked not only personal embarrassment, but the reputation of their family. The dance master's task was to prevent such humiliations at all costs. Many dance masters also composed new sequences, blending traditional patterns with innovations that kept court entertainment fresh. They often collaborated closely with musicians, ensuring that choreography and music complemented each other seamlessly. In doing so, they elevated dance from a pastime to a true performance art, one that could impress visiting dignitaries or mark special celebrations with unique, memorable displays. Their influence extended into matters of courtly strategy. A well-placed dance master could subtly arrange pairings between certain nobles, encourage reconciliations, or create situations where alliances might blossom. Because they worked so closely with both the highest and lowest ranks of the court, they often became trusted intermediaries, moving between worlds with unusual freedom. For ambitious courtiers, earning the approval of the dance master was almost as important as impressing the monarch. A master who vouched for a pupil's elegance could open doors to invitations and partnerships otherwise out of reach. Conversely, a master's quiet disapproval could mean being overlooked in the most prestigious dances of the evening. By the late Middle Ages, the role of the dance master had become indispensable. They were more than instructors. They were curators of refinement, guardians of tradition, and the silent stage managers of the glittering theatre that was the medieval court. If the choreography was the skeleton of courtly dance, then costumes and music were its flesh and blood, the elements that turned movement into spectacle. Late medieval courts understood the power of visual and auditory splendor, and no grand dance could succeed without them. For the nobility, attire was never chosen casually. Gowns for women were made of heavy silks, velvets, and brocades, often layered to create dramatic movement as they turned. Trains swept across the polished floors, and sleeves, sometimes so long they brushed the ground, moved like banners in the rhythm of the steps. Men wore doublets and hose in rich fabrics, often paired with cloaks or short mantles that flared with each stride. Jewels caught the candlelight, turning the dancers into moving constellations. Colour, too, was a language. Deep reds, royal blues, and gold embroidery signalled wealth and status, while heraldic patterns proclaimed family alliances. A skilled dancer could use the swish of a gown or the fall of a sleeve to emphasize grace, making costume and choreography inseparable. Music was equally crucial. Court musicians used lutes, harps, viols, shawms, and sackbuts to create a sound that filled the great halls without overpowering conversation. For stately dances like the pavan or bass dance, compositions were slow and measured, allowing for precise, deliberate movements. Faster dances later in the evening, like the galliard, shifted the tone, inviting athletic footwork and bursts of energy. The music was often tailored to the specific occasion. Composers and dance masters collaborated to ensure that steps matched the phrasing, so that every turn, bow, and glide fell in perfect harmony with the melody. The effect was hypnotic, a hall full of dancers moving as though they were part of a single great machine of elegance. The setting added its own grandeur. Dances took place in glittering great halls illuminated by hundreds of candles, their light reflecting off gold-leafed walls and polished floors. Tapestries depicting mythic or chivalric scenes hung above, reinforcing the ideals of love, honor, and beauty that the dances were meant to embody. In this environment, the dance was more than entertainment. It was theatre. Every costume, every note, and every step was part of a carefully constructed performance designed to impress, seduce, and solidify the social order. For the late medieval court, beauty was power, and the spectacle of dance was one of its most potent displays. In the late medieval court, the dance floor was as much a place for romance as it was for display. Beneath the polished etiquette and choreographed steps lay a subtle game of attraction, one that allowed men and women to signal interest, exchange glances, and test compatibility, all under the watchful eyes of the court. Courtly love, the chivalric ideal that shaped much of noble culture, found a perfect stage in the structured elegance of dance. Partners moved in patterns that mirrored the ebb and flow of a romantic pursuit, approaching, retreating, circling each other in measured steps. Each motion had its own meaning. A bow could convey respect, a turn could be an invitation, and a prolonged touch of the hand could carry the promise of something more. For young nobles, a dance was often their first sanctioned physical contact with a potential suitor. It offered a rare chance to converse privately while still remaining in a public setting. Words could be exchanged in low tones, hidden beneath the hum of music, while eyes met in ways that court protocol would normally forbid. But courtship through dance was also a matter of skill. A partner who moved with confidence and rhythm demonstrated self-control and refinement, traits as desirable in a spouse as they were in a courtier. A misstep or awkward pause, by contrast, could tarnish an impression just as surely as a poorly chosen word in conversation. The selection of partners was itself a strategic act. Being invited to dance by a high-ranking noble could raise one's social standing, while securing a dance with a particularly admired lady or gentleman could spark rumors that traveled far beyond the Great Hall. These pairings were closely observed, and more than one marriage alliance began with a turn on the floor. Dance also provided a safe outlet for flirtation. In an age where overt declarations of love could be dangerous, either politically or socially, the coded gestures and controlled proximity of dance allowed romance to bloom discreetly. The game was in the balance, showing just enough to intrigue, never so much as to scandalize. In this way, the courtly dance became both a rehearsal for love and, at times, the first act of a marriage story. It was here, amid the candlelight and music, that many noble romances began, not with words, but with steps. While courtly dance followed certain shared principles across Europe, elegance, order, and symbolism, its specific forms varied from region to region, shaped by local traditions, music, and even politics. The late Middle Ages was a time of increasing travel among the nobility, whether for diplomacy, marriage alliances, or tournaments. And with this movement came a steady exchange of dance styles. In Italy, courts in Florence, Milan, and Ferrara favoured intricate choreographies and faster tempos than their northern counterparts. Italian dance masters, such as Domenico da Piacenza, began codifying steps and publishing manuals, transforming dance into a formal discipline. These dances often involved complex floor patterns and alternating slow and lively sections, reflecting the Italian flair for theatricality. In France, the Burgundian court was a cultural powerhouse, and its basse dance became the standard of refinement throughout much of Europe. French style emphasized grace over complexity, with long, sweeping movements and a dignified pace. The music tended towards stately rhythms, perfectly suited to the glittering processions that opened court events. England absorbed influences from both France and Italy, blending them with its own folk traditions. While the nobility performed imported Basque dances and pavanis, more energetic country dances often followed in less formal settings, allowing courtiers to display a lighter, more playful side after the evening's formalities. The Iberian Peninsula added its own flavour, influenced by centuries of cultural interaction between Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities. Court dances there often incorporated rhythmic footwork and hand movements, reminiscent of Moorish traditions, paired with the distinctive sounds of early Spanish stringed instruments. These regional distinctions did not remain isolated. Royal marriages brought foreign dance masters into new courts, carrying their steps and musical styles with them. Diplomatic visits often included performances meant to impress guests with the court's sophistication, prompting nobles to adopt and adapt dances from abroad. Tournaments and festivals were also fertile grounds for exchange. Knights and ladies who travelled to compete or spectate often returned home with new dances to show their own courts, sometimes altering them to better fit local taste or music. By the dawn of the Renaissance, this constant flow of cultural exchange had created a shared European language of courtly dance, one that allowed nobles from different kingdoms to take to the floor together with ease, while still retaining the distinctive flavour of their homeland. By the close of the 15th century, the courtly dance tradition of the late Middle Ages had laid the groundwork for the spectacular dance culture of the Renaissance. What began as a way to bring order and refinement to post-feast entertainment had evolved into a fully codified art form, one that blended music, fashion, etiquette, and social strategy into a single glittering display. Its influence was visible not only in the steps themselves, but in the values they reinforced. Courtly dance celebrated discipline, control, and harmonious movement, qualities that mirrored the ideals of a well-governed court. Every glide, bow, and turn reflected the hierarchy and decorum that underpinned noble society. Even centuries later, these ideals would continue to shape how dance functioned in the great courts of Europe. The Basque dance and pavan, two of the era's signature dances, did not fade into obscurity, but evolved into Renaissance forms that retained their stately elegance while incorporating more elaborate figures. Likewise, the galliard, allemande, and other Renaissance favourites owed their existence to the late medieval marriage of music and movement perfected in the earlier courts. Beyond technique, late medieval courtly dance left a legacy of dance as diplomacy. It had proven that the dance floor could be a political stage, a place where alliances were signalled, negotiations softened, and courtship played out in full view. This tradition carried forward, with monarchs of the Renaissance and Baroque periods using grand balls as much for political theatre as for celebration. The tradition also helped cement the profession of the dance master, whose influence would only grow in later centuries. By training generations of nobles, these instructors ensured that courtly dance's principles of elegance and precision were passed down, adapted, and refined for changing tastes. Even in modern historical reenactments and heritage festivals, the ghost of the late medieval courtly dance remains. The slow procession of the pavan, the gliding steps of the Basque dance, the rustle of heavy gowns across polished floors. These images evoke a world where movement itself was a language and where beauty and discipline were inseparable. In the end, the legacy of late medieval courtly dance is more than a collection of steps. It is the enduring idea that in the right setting, movement can embody culture, politics, and romance all at once, a lesson Europe's courts never forgot. But then, faint at first, came the sound. A rhythmic, almost hypnotic thump-thump the beat of countless oars hitting the water in unison. It grew louder, steadier, more menacing with each passing moment. Out of the mist emerged shapes, long, narrow silhouettes slicing effortlessly through the current. Their carved prows were monstrous figures, dragons and serpents with snarling mouths, painted eyes glaring at the shore. The gold and crimson shields along their sides caught what little sunlight pierced the fog, flashing like warnings. These were not merchant vessels. These were warships. At their head, towering over the rest, was the flagship. Upon its deck stood a man whose name would be burned into Frankish memory for centuries, Ragnar Lodbrok. Draped in furs, mail glinting at his shoulders, and with a weather-beaten face that spoke of storms survived and enemies crushed, he was every bit the legend whispered about in coastal villages. His men, seasoned raiders from Denmark and Norway, eyed the riverbanks with a predator's patience. The fleet's numbers were staggering. Chroniclers later claimed around 120 ships, each carrying warriors armed with axes, spears, and round shields. If true, that meant nearly 5,000 men were bearing down on Paris, the jewel of the Frankish kingdom. They moved as a single organism, their oars dipping in perfect synchronization, the drumbeats echoing across the water like the heart of some vast beast. Villagers along the Seine froze in terror as the ships slid past. Some fled inland, clutching what few belongings they could carry. Others dropped to their knees in desperate prayer. They knew the stories, how Viking raids left towns burning, livestock slaughtered, and people dragged away in chains. No one wanted to be the next victim. Paris, with its churches, markets, and treasure-laden monasteries, lay further upriver, seemingly protected by its fortified walls. But to the men in those ships, walls were not deterrents, they were challenges. And the Seine, winding deeper into the heart of Frankish power, was an open invitation. Ragnar's eyes never left the river ahead. The siege was not yet begun, but in his mind, Paris was already his. As Ragnar's fleet pressed upriver, the Frankish defenders scrambled to react. News of the longships had travelled faster than the ships themselves, carried by terrified villagers and monks fleeing the lower Seine. By the time the first war drums echoed near the outskirts of Paris, King Charles the Bald's scouts had already reported the grim truth. This was no small raid. This was an invasion. Charles, ruling from his court in the heart of the kingdom, faced a dilemma. His army was scattered across his territories, and the main force he could muster quickly was a modest contingent of warriors and mercenaries. Still, he ordered them forward to meet the Vikings before they reached the city walls. The chosen battleground was near the riverbank, where a narrow passage forced the ships to slow. But Ragnar was no stranger to traps. He knew the Franks would try to block his advance, and he welcomed it. As his ships approached the shallows, he ordered several to run aground. From them poured scores of warriors, their shields interlocking into a wall of wood and iron. Behind that wall came the axemen, their weapons glinting as they charged. The first clash was brutal. The Franks, clad in mail and carrying long spears, tried to hold their line, but the Vikings fought with a ferocity that stunned their opponents. Their battle cries, deep guttural roars, echoed over the river, meant to unnerve as much as to kill. Frankish shields splintered under the relentless blows of Danish axes, and the neat ranks began to falter. Ragnar himself waded into the fight, his presence turning the tide wherever he struck. Chroniclers would later say he wielded his sword as though it were an extension of his arm, cutting down any who dared block his path. The Frankish formation broke, and panic spread like wildfire. Those who could fled toward Paris, hoping the city's walls would shelter them. The Vikings gave chase only briefly. Ragnar had no interest in scattering his forces too soon. The river remained the key, and his fleet still had miles to go before the true prize. By nightfall, the Franks' forward defence was gone. The road and the Seine lay open. Ragnar's fleet reassembled, their shields now streaked with blood and their morale higher than ever. The first strike had been devastating, and Paris now stood within their grasp. The Franks had lost their forward guard, but Paris still stood ahead, its fortified walls rising over the Ile de la Cité, the island heart of the city where the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne loomed. In theory, the river itself was Paris's greatest defence. The Seine split into two channels around the island, and both were narrow enough to control with wooden bridges and fortified gates. But in the spring of 845, those defences would be tested as never before. Ragnar's fleet arrived at the approaches to Paris with the confidence of victors. The Vikings knew the Franks would try to bar the way with chains stretched across the water and guard towers posted on the bridges. Ragnar's answer was simple: hold the river, choke off supplies, and force the city to yield. He ordered his ships to anchor in both channels, their prows facing upstream to meet any attack. Raiding parties were sent ashore to burn outlying farms, cut roads, and destroy ferry crossings. The message was unmistakable. No one entered or left Paris without passing through Viking hands. The once busy river traffic was gone overnight, replaced by the ominous silhouettes of longships and the watchful eyes of Norse warriors leaning on their spears. Inside Paris, tension rose quickly. Merchants feared their goods would rot before reaching market. The poor dreaded hunger. Priests led processions around the city walls, chanting prayers for divine intervention. The people knew that if the Vikings chose to wait, famine and disease would do their work for them. But Ragnar was not a man of patience. The blockade was only step one. As his men secured the riverbanks, he sent small detachments to scout for weaknesses in the city's defences. They returned with valuable news. Parts of the outer suburbs were undefended. The main Frankish forces had retreated behind the island walls, leaving warehouses, granaries, and homes vulnerable. Within days, smoke rose on the horizon. Ragnar's men swept through the undefended districts, seizing food, valuables, and captives. These raids had a dual purpose: feed the army and terrify the population. Every day the Vikings held the river, Paris grew weaker. By the end of the first week, the blockade was complete. The Seine was no longer the lifeline of Paris. It was a prison wall, and Ragnar Lodbrok held the keys. For those living beyond the safety of Paris's walls, the siege was not just a distant rumour. It was a nightmare playing out in their own fields and homes. Ragnar's men, emboldened by their easy victories, fanned out along the Seine like wolves through a sheepfold. No village was too small, no farm too remote to escape their reach. By day, columns of smoke marked where the Vikings had struck. Barns and storehouses were set alight, sending sparks into the sky. The flames devoured food meant to sustain the Frankish people through the year, ensuring that even if Paris withstood the siege, hunger would still haunt the land. By night, the glow of burning hamlets reflected off the water, turning the river into a shimmering path of fire. The raiders worked with methodical cruelty. They took grain, livestock, and valuables, loading them onto longships or simply slaughtering what they could not carry. But perhaps most devastating was their capture of people. Men were often cut down where they stood, but women and children were herded together, bound, and forced toward the ships. For the Vikings, these captives were as valuable as gold, to be sold as slaves in markets far to the north. The psychological toll was immense. Refugees flooded toward Paris, their stories feeding a growing panic inside the city. Some spoke of warriors with faces painted in blue and black, their hair wild and eyes alight with a battle madness that made them seem less like men and more like spirits of vengeance. Others swore Ragnar himself had been seen laughing amid the smoke, as though destruction were his sport. The Frankish garrisons within Paris could do little but watch from the walls. Every attempt to send out a rescue party ended in disaster. The Vikings controlled the river crossings, and any force that ventured too far from the gates risked being cut off and annihilated. Ragnar understood that terror was as much a weapon as the axe. Each raid was a reminder that nowhere outside the walls was safe. The people of Paris could hear the cries of the taken and smell the burning from their own homes. The message was clear: surrender, or watch the world beyond your gates turn to ash. By the second week, the siege of Paris had evolved from a series of raids into a stranglehold. Ragnar Lodbrok was no longer merely disrupting the city, he was starving it. Every bridge, crossing and supply route was firmly under Norse control. The Seine, once the artery that brought life to Paris, now served as the Vikings' iron collar around its neck. From his position on the river, Ragnar could see the city's defences in their entirety. The Ile de la Cité bristled with watchtowers, its bridges barricaded with heavy wooden gates reinforced by iron. The Frankish garrison manned them day and night, but Ragnar noticed the signs of strain: torches burning low, guards slouching with exhaustion, and fewer patrols each night. Siege warfare was as much about patience as force, and Ragnar's men had patience enough when it promised plunder. Food within Paris grew scarce quickly. Merchants who had once enjoyed thriving river trade now watched their warehouses empty without hope of resupply. The wealthy hoarded what they could, while the poor queued in long lines at monasteries, praying for bread. Rumours began to circulate of families eating whatever they could find: dogs, pigeons, even leather boiled into thin soup. The mood inside the city shifted from defiance to desperation. Ragnar made sure to deepen that desperation. He ordered his men to conduct nightly torchlit parades along the riverbanks, banging their shields and shouting insults in Old Norse. The noise carried across the water, making sleep difficult for the already weary Parisians. Sometimes the Vikings launched flaming arrows into undefended areas, more to frighten than destroy, but always reminding the inhabitants that the enemy was near. Inside the Frankish command, tempers frayed. King Charles the Bald faced pressure from his nobles. Some urged an immediate assault to break the blockade. Others insisted they hold out for reinforcements. But every passing day meant more mouths to feed and fewer supplies to feed them. Ragnar knew the city's breaking point was approaching. His blockade was airtight, his men were well fed on the spoils of the countryside, and his ships, anchored in a defensive crescent, ensured that no relief could arrive unseen. Paris might have had its walls, but Ragnar Lodbrok had the river. And in this war, the river was deciding the victor. The breaking point came on a grey, rain-slicked morning. From the towers of Paris, Frankish sentries spotted Ragnar's men, hauling more supplies ashore from captured farms upriver. It was a taunt as much as a necessity, proof that the Vikings feasted while Paris starved. The city's leaders could stand no more. Orders were given for a sortie, a sudden, forceful attack meant to smash the blockade and bring back desperately needed food. The gates on the right bank swung open, and a column of Frankish soldiers poured out. They came armed with long spears, swords, and heavy kite shields, their banners whipping in the wind. At their head rode a handful of mounted nobles, their polished armour glinting in the morning light. Their goal was to reach and destroy the Viking camp on the north shore, then retreat before the raiders could regroup. But Ragnar had been expecting this. His scouts, posted along the river's bends, had seen the gates open and relayed the news in minutes. By the time the Franks reached the muddy fields near the riverbank, shield walls were already forming. The two sides collided in a clash of iron and fury. The Franks fought with discipline, their tight ranks pushing forward in unison, while the Vikings relied on brutal individual ferocity, axemen smashing into shields, spearmen jabbing at gaps in armor, and archers loosing arrows into the advancing enemy. The noise was deafening, metal on metal, shouts in Frankish and Norse, and the screams of the wounded. For a moment, it seemed the Franks might break through. Their cavalry charged, scattering some of Ragnar's front line, but the Vikings had a counter, hidden reserves bursting from the tree line. They struck the Frankish flank with savage speed, cutting down footmen and forcing the cavalry to wheel around in confusion. The Frankish commander ordered a retreat, but it was too late. The narrow causeway back to the gates was clogged with men, and the Vikings pressed their advantage. Many soldiers were cut down before they could reach the safety of the city walls. By midday, the gates slammed shut once more, this time with fewer defenders inside to hold them. The attempt to break the siege had failed, and Ragnar Lodbrok, watching from his ship, knew the city was now weaker than ever. The failed breakout marked a grim turning point. Paris had gambled its strength and lost. Ragnar's grip on the river remained firm, and now the city was not only hungry, it was sick. It began quietly. A few soldiers fell ill, complaining of fever and aching joints. Then came the swelling, the coughing, and the telltale blotches on the skin. Within days, the sickness spread beyond the barracks to the crowded homes and markets. The exact disease is lost to history, perhaps dysentery from tainted water, or plague carried by vermin, but its effects were devastating. The cramped quarters of a besieged city made perfect breeding grounds for infection. Families huddled together for warmth and safety, sharing food, air, and germs. The monasteries, where the sick were taken, overflowed within days. Priests administered last rites in hushed tones, their own faces pale with fear. Bells tolled constantly, marking the passage of yet another victim. Ragnar's men soon heard of the illness, and while the Vikings were not untouched, camp life on the riverbanks was far from clean. They suffered less. Their ships allowed them to move freely, their camps were more spread out, and fresh supplies kept them stronger. The Franks, trapped behind walls, had no such advantage. Inside Paris, panic grew. Rumors whispered through the streets that the sickness was a punishment from God for the city's sins, that traitors had poisoned the wells, or that the very presence of the pagans outside the walls had cursed the land. The truth mattered little. Fear did the work of any weapon. The plague's psychological effect was as dangerous as its physical toll. The garrison, already worn thin, saw men desert their posts to care for sick relatives or to hide from the inevitable. Merchants abandoned their stalls, and food hoarding became rampant. The rich shut themselves away, while the poor scavenged whatever scraps they could find. From his flagship, Ragnar could see the change. The city's walls still stood, but the life inside was rotting. Every coughing fit that echoed across the river was, to him, another sign that time was on his side. Paris was weakening without a single blow to its gates, and Ragnar Lodbrok intended to press that advantage until the city had no choice but to bow. By late March, the situation inside Paris had reached its breaking point. Hunger gnawed at every household. The plague claimed victims daily, and morale among the defenders was collapsing. The failed sortie had proven the Franks could not break Ragnar's blockade by force. The only path left was one of humiliation, negotiation. King Charles the Bald, though not in Paris himself, knew the city's fall would be a political catastrophe. If the jewel of his kingdom was sacked, the other great towns of the Frankish realm might follow. Worse, a complete defeat would embolden every Norse chieftain along the northern coasts. Reluctantly, he agreed to open talks with the Viking leader. Envoys were sent downriver under a flag of truce, their small boat gliding past the lines of anchored longships. The Vikings watched in silence, their shields gleaming in the spring sun, until the vessel reached Ragnar's flagship. There the envoys were brought aboard to meet the man whose name had haunted the Frankish coasts for years. Accounts differ on what happened next, but all agree Ragnar made his demands clear. A ransom so vast it would be remembered for generations. The price he set was 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, an unimaginable sum for the time. It was not merely payment, it was a statement that the Franks had been forced to kneel. The envoys protested, arguing that the kingdom could not pay such an amount. Ragnar, unmoved, simply reminded them of the fate awaiting Paris if they refused. He described in chilling detail how his men would burn the city, slaughter its defenders, and carry off thousands as slaves. He even offered them a preview by pointing upriver, where smoke still rose from villages his men had pillaged that very morning. With no real choice, the envoys returned to Charles, who, after furious debate with his nobles, agreed to the payment. It was a staggering blow to the royal treasury, but losing Paris would have been worse. Orders went out to gather every available coin, chalice, and ornament that could be melted down for silver and gold. When the final decision was sent back to Ragnar, the Viking warlord smiled. Without storming a single gate, he had bent one of Europe's mightiest kingdoms to his will. The agreement was swift once the ransom was secured. Over the following days, carts laden with silver and gold rolled down to the Seine under heavy Frankish guard. Priests muttered prayers as each load was weighed and counted, as if hoping divine displeasure might be soothed by the offering. Every coin, chalice, and ornament represented the wealth of monasteries, noble estates, and the royal treasury itself. When the final tally reached Ragnar's demanded 7,000 pounds, the Vikings wasted no time. The treasure was divided among the crews, each man receiving a share according to his rank. The chieftains claimed the largest portions, but even the lowest oarsmen walked away with riches enough to live in comfort for years. For Ragnar, it was the ultimate prize, not only wealth beyond measure, but the satisfaction of having extracted it without losing the bulk of his force in a bloody assault. On the morning of their departure, the Viking fleet prepared for the journey back downriver. The longships, heavy with plunder, rocked gently in the current. The Franks watched from the walls, wary of a last-minute betrayal. But Ragnar was true to his word. Paris would be spared, at least for now. The siege had served its purpose. Before leaving, Ragnar staged one final display. His ships rode in tight formation past the city's walls, shields raised along the sides, banners snapping in the wind. War horns blared, not as a threat, but as a reminder. Paris had bent the knee to the Northmen. Some chroniclers claim Ragnar even allowed captured Frankish prisoners to shout warnings to the people, that the Vikings would return if the kingdom dared forget the lesson of 845. As the fleet disappeared into the bends of the Seine, relief swept through the city. Bells rang out, and priests led processions of thanksgiving. But the celebration was muted. The cost had been immense, and the humiliation greater still. Charles the Bald had preserved Paris, but he had done so by emptying his coffers into the hands of pagans. For Ragnar Lodbrok, the journey home would cement his legend. He had faced one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms, blockaded its capital, and sailed away richer than any Viking before him. and across the Frankish realm one truth echoed. Paris had been spared not by swords, but by silver.